So I'm Derek Arden and welcome to Monday Night Live, live and uncut podcast with people from all round the world. I'm delighted to introduce the Honourable Lieutenant General Karen Gibson from the US Army. Karen is styled the Honourable Karen Gibson because she served as the Sergeant at Arms in the US Senate. That's a presidential appointment confirmed by the state, one of the most senior non-elected roles in the US government, responsible for security protocol and operations of the US Senate. And Karen will tell us more about that in a minute. But just a bit of background on Karen. Karen joined the US Army straight from university, beginning her service in Alaska before moving into military intelligence. Karen rose to the rank of Lieutenant General, leading intelligence operations across Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, East Africa, and the Middle East. Following the events that we all saw on January the 6th, 2021, Karen was asked to serve as the Sergeant at Arms in the US Senate, a role Karen held for 4 years with responsibility for security operations and leadership of over 1,000 staff at one of the most crucial moments in recent US history. Karen, thanks so much for joining us. We are all honored. Tell us a bit about the real Karen Gibson.
Thank you, Derek. It's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy talking about these experiences and kind of sharing what it's actually like to either serve in the armed forces or, frankly, on Capitol Hill, two areas where Hollywood doesn't do us any favors in terms of accuracy, and there are often a lot of myths to puncture. So, to tell you a little bit about, the real Karen Gibson, as you mentioned, I think before we began. I am from Montana, grew up in Montana, a very different place half a century ago. We had dirt roads and no McDonald's. And if there was meat on the table, it was something my father shot, literally. We were talking about snow earlier. There would be snow in town from September to June, perhaps not always on the ground, but I know the day I graduated from high school in June, I woke up, looked out the window, and there was snow on the ground. It was gone by noon, but that was just that kind of environment in the Northern Rockies. And I loved living there, but did not want to go to college there. My father worked at the state university. I grew up in a small college town in the Northern Rockies. I did go to summer school there one summer, and I could leave my parents' house at 12:56 and make it to my 1 o'clock class on a bicycle. So I certainly wasn't going to go to, you're 18, you're desperate to be on your own. I wasn't about to go to college there. So my father, well, actually, I really wanted to be an engineer. I loved science. I was good at math. I applied to and was accepted at Purdue University. And my dad said, "Congratulations, that's a great school. How are you going to pay that out of state tuition?" And he suggested that I consider ROTC, which is the Reserve Officer Training Corps, a program by which the military services in the United States will pay for your college and tuition at a 4-year institution. And then in return, when you graduate, you owe the military 4 years on active duty. And when you're 18, long range planning for me was kind of, what am I doing this weekend? And maybe is there a test I should be studying for? I really, this prospect of actually serving in uniform was about as distant as like wrinkles and motherhood. In other words, it was never actually going to happen to me. And then the day that I went on active duty, I know I borrowed a car from my parents and I drove 3 days from Montana down to Fort Huachuca, Arizona. And when I turned off the interstate and I looked up this lonely 2-lane road in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, 15 miles from the Mexican border, and I thought, what have I signed up for? This is serious stuff. I wasn't really thinking when I raised my hand. Can't get out of it. This had better work out. And I was very fortunate that it did. It did not take long until I absolutely loved being in the Army. I went from being a very reluctant soldier to an enthusiastic one. As you've mentioned, my first duty station was in Alaska, which was a very physically harsh environment, particularly in the winter, but I felt that I was well suited to that based on my upbringing in the Rockies. And what I really loved about the military was that it challenged every facet of my being, physically, mentally, intellectually, as a leader, morally, sometimes spiritually. And each time you accomplish something challenging, they gave you something a little harder to do. And I just loved that. And I loved serving alongside other men and women who wanted to do the same thing and who wanted to be part of a team that was advancing, things for the good of our nation, really serving society, and that was very exciting to me. I guess I would add as a side note, I did have the privilege later in my career to serve many times alongside people from the UK. Probably, I think. Most of the last 12 years of my career, I was working for someone from the Commonwealth, or they were working for me. And they were tremendous contributors to our work in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, and really true partners that we relied on very heavily. So I served in the military, and it was very exciting. 5 years in Alaska. It's where I met my husband, got married, had my first child. We went to Hawaii. That's where I had my second child. We went as a family to Korea for 4 years, the Republic of Korea, which was absolutely fascinating. And by then, 9/11 had occurred, and most of my focus, like that of many other people in the U.S. Army, was on events and developments in the broader Middle East, and I'll extend that region from like Egypt to Pakistan, Yemen to Kazakhstan. And so, as you mentioned, Derek, I had the opportunity to deploy to East Africa, to Afghanistan, to Iraq, and then ultimately, as the director of intelligence for military operations for that part of the world, spent a lot of time in the broader Middle East. It was deeply satisfying. I wouldn't trade it for anything, but one day I woke up and decided I was done. I didn't really, I had actually at that point as a three-star general, it didn't look like I would ever have fun again. I had nothing left for me in terms of battles except policy fights in the halls of the Pentagon, and that didn't really appeal to me. So for a variety of reasons, I decided that I would retire. And so
Did you feel that you got to a level where you didn't quite have as much action?
Oh, for sure. For sure. Yes. When I left my last operational assignment, I was a two-star general, and you give your little farewell speech, and I told my male counterparts, the operators, how jealous I was, that they would get to go on and serve as corps commanders, combined joint task force commanders, combatant commanders. But as an intel officer, I'd kind of hit the top of the ladder operationally, and really had nothing left for me but again, policy fights in DC, and I was envious. Um, so I retired, dropped my paperwork in the fall of 19, had my ceremony on March 2nd, 2020, the last time most of my friends gathered as a group, flew on a plane, the last ceremony they held at the Women in Military Service Memorial. By the time I signed out of the Army on March 31st, we were wearing masks and gloves, and my DD 214 discharge paperwork says I left the Army with dirty teeth because the dental clinic had closed for service and I couldn't get a final exam. When you go through the transition course to prepare for retirement as a senior military officer, they tell you a lot of things are going to be very different. And one of the things you should prepare for or expect is that you'll be seeing a lot more of your spouse than you did before. Nobody says anything about quarantine. And so it was quite something to go from the busy operational life to being locked in the house with this guy that I married 30 years ago and hoping that it turns out you still want to be together. Fortunately, that worked out too. We are still married. And I kind of started to dabble in online consulting and teaching national security strategy at Georgetown University. I did that for about a year. January 6th happened. I think we've all seen on television, footage of how that occurred. Deeply upsetting to me, regardless of your feelings about the election, to imagine that American citizens would attack the seat of our government like that was beyond my imagining. And I thought, this isn't what happens in countries I deploy to. This is what I expect to see in Baghdad, not in Washington, D.C. And within about 30 days, I was approached by Senate leadership about filling the vacancy that had been created when they fired the entire security team. I had just said if there was anything I could do to ensure this never happened again, I would want to know that I had done that. And here I'm being offered an opportunity to make some permanent fixes. So even though I was not looking for a full-time job, did not seek or want a full-time job, I felt I could not say no. And I said yes. People told me it's going to be challenging. It's going to be difficult. Nobody told me it would also be fun. And I just enjoyed it tremendously. It was among the top three roles I've held in my career, and I really enjoyed it. But I left the US Senate about a year ago. I will correct one thing from your introduction, Derek. It is not a presidential appointment. I know that's what honorable typically means. The Senate chooses their own sergeant at arms. The president does not. We have, separation of powers are quite strict here and very different between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The sergeant at arms is selected by the Senate and confirmed by the Senate. The president doesn't have any say. So, and they're very, very adamant about the president not deciding what happens within the legislative branch.
So
And that,
when I was
yeah,
asking you about the Sergeant at Arms, you were giving me a bit of British history, weren't you, about the fact that
yeah.
we were about 4 months ahead of America having a Sergeant at Arms. Just run that past.
Oh, more than 4 months, centuries. So Sergeant at Arms, thank you for asking. Because when I go to like networking events or, even I hesitate to even put it on my resume because nobody knows what it is. And my full title was Sergeant at Arms and Doorkeeper of the United States Senate, which doesn't fit on any form that you've ever seen. Um, and and when I go to events and people ask, oh, what do you do? And I say, I'm the Senate Sergeant at Arms. Never, no one ever says, "Oh, me too," or I thought about that. I mean, just nobody. It's not on anyone's radar. So it always requires a bit of an explanation. And I appreciate you asking. It is an archaic medieval term that comes from Europe. Richard the Lionheart took several sergeants at arms with him on the Crusades as part of his personal bodyguard. And I don't remember which one. I think it was Henry V. I think it was the Agincourt guy was the first to put sergeants at arms in Westminster to protect the Parliament. Um, and so the UK has had sergeants at arms in Parliament ever since. When the United States created its system of government, unique in its inception, really unlike any other at that time, we did copy a few things from the nation we'd just broken away from, a two-body legislative branch, an upper house and a lower house. And we copied this sergeant at arms idea as someone who would be responsible for security. And over time, that role has evolved incredibly in the US Senate, and it's about far more now than just law enforcement.
So what were your responsibilities?
Yeah. So, okay, so I'll give you a little more trivia in case you're ever on Jeopardy or something. So the Constitution, which we began to operate under in 1789, says that the Senate will appoint officers as it sees fit. So one of the very first things the Senate did in April 1789 was appoint a sergeant at arms, and James Mather, and the next day a secretary. And 4 months later, George Washington was inaugurated as our first president. So here's the Jeopardy trivia. This means that we've had a sergeant at arms in the Senate longer than we've had a president of the United States. But I never got that kind of recognition, but it is, I suspect, perhaps the oldest office in the US government. And James Mather had three jobs. The first was to watch the door, which is the origin of the law enforcement role of the sergeant at arms. He also had to procure firewood because that's how they kept the place warm in those days, which the sergeant at arms still does because there are fireplaces in the Capitol building and people like to, it's a very beautiful ambiance. They like to, in the wintertime, have a little fire going in the office. And the sergeant at arms procures the firewood. And he was responsible for the stables, taking care of the horses. We no longer have horses, but the sergeant at arms runs the motor pool, the vehicle fleet, the shuttle bus, the parking lot enforcement, et cetera. I figured James Mather probably had a couple of stable boys to help him muck out the stalls. And he would be shocked to see that it's over 1,000 people now. And in particular, that the role has grown not just for the Senate in Washington, D.C., but for the 450 offices, I believe you call them ridings in the UK, that the senators have around back in their home states. their leases, their furniture, their mail delivery, their security, and in particular that the Sergeant at Arms runs all the computer systems and IT and cybersecurity, the television studio, the page dorm, the barber shop, visas, not visas, passports, all kinds of additional services that are required to allow the Senate to run fall under the purview of the Sergeant at Arms today.
And how, well, I asked you last week, how did you manage to manage over 1,000 people with all those responsibilities of cyber
Yeah.
security,
Yes.
IT? And one
Yeah.
of the things you told me that you had to negotiate was how many guns people brought into the Senate.
Yes. Well, guns are not allowed on the Capitol grounds unless you are in a certain law enforcement capacity. So the Capitol Police, the legislative branch has its own law enforcement. It's not the FBI or the city police. It's specific to the legislative branch. They are authorized to have weapons. And when others come, perhaps a head of state or someone who typically has a protective detail, we may have a discussion about how many armed guards they will bring with them. And, even the FBI, for instance, if they want to come and testify before Congress, they don't automatically get to bring the weapon that they typically carry with them on a daily basis with them to a hearing. And so these are discussions that we have based on need and the threat.
Wow. Wow. And how did you manage it? Come on, Karen. We all want to know how you managed 1,000 people.
Oh, I think probably many of your listeners have led much larger organizations. I led larger organizations in the military. It's less about the number of people that are under you. Certainly you have, they're not 1,000 direct reports, right? You have deputies and chiefs of staff and, assistant directors, et cetera, and this sort of hierarchy. I think what makes things complicated is the complexity of the operations more than the number of people that are under you. And so, for instance, in a military scenario, there were many times I would lead very complex, dynamic, fast moving, supporting operations on a battlefield. That's complex. And that really requires a high functioning team. I had the custodians at the Capitol, the barbershop, et cetera. Those tend not to be dynamic and fast moving. But what I did find was that the standards and the expectations for execution of the mission were incredibly high, that there was very little tolerance for error. That was something that took some adjustment for me. When I first got there, especially coming from the military and from some very dynamic combat oriented theaters, my philosophy, first question is anyone wounded? Is there blood? No, I think we're okay. But, when people are all in a tizzy about, the font size or, the size of the margins on some sign somewhere, it was a little hard for me to get as excited as some of the other folks. And so just that was something that was quite different moving from the legislative branch to, or I'm sorry, from the military to the legislative branch was the kinds of things that people get very excited about and the standards that people expected.
So you must have met some very interesting people. I won't ask you who was your favorite, but just give us a flavor for the people that you had to escort into the.
Yeah. Yeah, so the sergeant at arms is also the protocol officer, and I had a protocol team, and they were very competent. And that when things are going on, that becomes something that people pay an awful lot of attention to. That is an area where there is very little margin for error. And as the protocol officer, I escorted heads of state when they were in the Capitol building. I didn't typically escort other high-ranking visitors. I didn't escort cabinet secretaries or celebrities. I was always missing the celebrities. They'd be like, "Oh, are you waiting for Bono to go by?" I was like, "Wait, he's here?" Like I didn't get a list in the morning of the celebrities that were coming and I missed a lot of them. But I had to escort the heads of state. And at first I didn't like that job. I felt, as I told you, Derek, I felt as superfluous as a hood ornament. You're kind of walking in front of this little procession. It's not like they don't know where to go. There's often a red carpet and there's Secret Service and police lining the corridor. It's not like they're going to accidentally turn in the wrong corridor usually. But after a while, I kind of I began to relish it, and just this opportunity to see or meet with many heads of state. So I met with yours. I escorted Boris Johnson when he came. I escorted Rishi Sunak. I escorted Sir Keir Starmer. I did not escort Liz Truss. She wasn't in office long enough to come to the United States. Um, uh, but I think I mentioned to you that Rishi Sunak, it would be a tie between Rishi Sunak and the King of Jordan, who walks the fastest. It was very difficult to keep up with him. He was moving at a high rate of speed. I will say, I always, even though I'd be formally dressed, I always wore shoes that I could run in. Just in general, that's my philosophy. Life's too short to wear uncomfortable shoes. I would not wear shoes that I could not run in. And the day Rishi Sunak was there, or Prime Minister Sunak, I should say, I was grateful for that. He's a
Wow.
very fast walker.
And who was going back to the whole of your career? What was the time you felt the most threatened?
Well, I could turn this. I have a whole, it's a whole nother chapter of my life. It's nothing to do with military operations. I was on the eve of a highly anticipated deployment to Iraq. I was in Korea during 9/11, and for a variety of reasons, I stayed there for 4 years. And then when I left, I really wanted to deploy. And the Army had other plans for me. They said, no, you're going to the Pentagon for 1 year, which I didn't like. And then 2 years to command a battalion, an important role, one I really wanted, but in the United States. So now it's been like 6 years after 9/11, and I have still not deployed. And I managed to snag a really plum assignment as the Deputy Intelligence Officer for the 18th Airborne Corps at Fort Bragg. And it was about 6 weeks before I was supposed to go, and I was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer.
Oh, wow.
And, I've skipped, cut to the chase, skipped the whole story of how that unfolded. And, you could have hit me in the face with a baseball bat, and I would not have been more stunned. And as the oncologist was telling me, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm afraid you will lose all your hair. I was like, yeah, I got that. When can I get to Baghdad? I just really misplaced priorities, to be honest. But I was young. Uh, and um, and he told me I wouldn't go anywhere for at least 5 years. And I just thought my life was over. Even if I survive, which spoiler alert, I did. Even if I survive, life as I know it is not going to be the same if I can't do this. And I
Mm,
actually asked to be treated at the big naval hospital at the time, Bethesda Naval Hospital in Washington, because I didn't want to go to Walter Reed and see soldiers if I couldn't be one. So I was treated by Navy corpsmen instead of Army doctors. And then after I recovered, I went doctor shopping, and I deployed for 2 of those 5 years. I don't know if that was the right thing to do, but that's what I did. It was very important to me. And so I went to, East Africa and then Afghanistan. And then at about the 7 year mark, I went to Iraq. And my deployment to Iraq was the most thrilling, exciting, best year of my career. That was for the Defeat ISIS campaign, not for Saddam Hussein. And I know your question was about the most when I felt most threatened, but I would certainly say, in the early stages of beginning those kinds of medical procedures, I think that's when I felt my life was at greatest risk. Now, in terms of Army stuff I did, probably helicopters. Rotary wing transportation is just inherently more higher risk than fixed wing aircraft. And I
mm.
flew in a lot of helicopters. But I love flying in helicopters, and I never felt scared, and it was always a lot of fun.
Great.
Probably. So I know maybe that wasn't the answer you would. So I will say it wasn't the most dangerous, but I actually really liked it. Was flying in and out of Baghdad. This is a horrible thing to say. Flying in and out of Baghdad, 2016 to 17. And when you come in in a fixed wing aircraft coming from Kuwait, you do what's called a combat landing, and the plane just goes like that to minimize the time that you're descending, and that you would be um, a target for people who want to shoot you down. And so I'm sitting in this little C-12, and you're looking out over the shoulder of the pilot, and you're looking at the runway just coming to meet you. That was kind of cool. And then and we would get in these little rotary wing aircraft, these helicopters run by a firm called Embassy Air. It was like the shuttle bus that would take you from the Baghdad International Airport to all the embassy complexes, and you fly kind of over Baghdad, and they have a tail gunner, and they're popping off flares that'll attract anything that's being shot at the helicopters, and you're all jammed in there with people from the embassy or soldiers or whatever in your body armor and your helmet, and I kind of like that. But anyway, I don't mean to sound flippant, because there are clearly people who lost lives and limbs and everything else, but I found my low level of excitement to be exciting.
And did you have to, just changing the subject, did you have to escort presidents of the United States
Oh,
around the
yes.
Senate? That was part of the job as well.
Yes, because the president is the head of state. So if the president comes to the Senate, I would escort him. And a lot of my friends would see us on television for the State of the Union, when the president addresses Congress, typically once a year, and the House and Senate Sergeant at Arms together escort the president, even though the address itself is given in the House of Representatives, because the Senate's not big enough to hold everybody.
Wow. Well, we're nearly at the end of the interview. I hope you'll come back and join us again at some stage, because I've got lots more questions to ask you. But the number one that I ask everybody these days is what piece of advice, what piece of wisdom from your huge experience would you give to people watching this, listening to the recordings in 2026?
Well, I think I would tell, most of your folks are in the UK. This may or may not pertain there, but my friends in the southeastern United States, invest in a backup generator. You never know whether it's an ice storm or, a hurricane or something that's going to take out power. We've always been grateful to have kind of uninterrupted power at our house. So invest in a backup generator.
Karen, that's quite ironic, isn't it, that we had a power cut in the middle of our rehearsals
Yes, it is.
in
Yes.
Guildford in
Well,
Surrey,
yeah,
but these type of things happen.
yeah.
Can I ask members of Monday Night Live to give Karen the usual vote of thanks in the normal Monday Night Live way? Thank you so much. And Karen, Lieutenant General Karen Gibson, thanks so much for joining Monday Night Live, and I hope you'll join us again in the
Of
not
course.
distant future.
Happy to.